Even though we have the evolutionary adaptations that allow us to run long distances remarkably well, the prevalence of injury in running is still quite high. At any given time, somewhere between 19 and 79% of runners are reported to have some kind of injury. Now, prevalence statistics like these don't really tell us what the risk of doing an activity like running actually is. For that, we need to know the incidence of injury. In other words, the number of new injuries that occur over a specific period of time. When incidence is measured, running injury rates are usually reported as somewhere between 6.8 and 50 injuries per 1,000 hours of running. Now that's a very broad estimate, but that wide range isn't surprising once you look at how these studies are conducted. Differences in the types of runners being studied, how injury is defined, how injuries are diagnosed, whether runners self-diagnose and self-report, and how long participants are followed for. All of these factors can dramatically influence the numbers we end up with. So while these statistics give us a useful overview, they don't tell us everything. What we do know is that the majority of running-related injuries are not acute injuries, but what we typically describe as chronic or overuse injuries. Acute injuries tend to present suddenly and are usually associated with a clear traumatic event. So for example, tearing a muscle or sustaining a fracture after a fall. Symptoms of an acute injury typically occur immediately or within 24 hours, and often include swelling, sharp pain, and sudden loss of function or strength. In contrast, most running injuries develop gradually over time, often without a single obvious triggering event. Pain and weakness still occur, but the pattern is often less clear. Symptoms may fluctuate, worsen with training, ease with rest, and then return when running is resumed. Because of this, many running injuries are better understood not simply as chronic, but as load-related injuries. Injuries that occur when the load placed on tissues exceeds their current capacity to tolerate it. Research has consistently shown that the most commonly injured body region in runners is the knee, followed by the lower leg, the foot, the ankle, the thigh, and the hip, in that order. Common diagnoses include patellar femoral pain, iliotibial band pain, Achilles tendinopathy, calf muscle strains, medial tibial stress syndrome, often referred to as shin splints, plantar fasciopathy, hamstring injuries, and stress fractures. So the obvious question is, if humans evolved to run long distances, why aren't our bodies better protected against injury? Why do running injuries appear to be so common? One hypothesis that's often raised is that running injury is a so-called mismatch condition, similar to conditions like type 2 diabetes or myopia, short-sightedness. From this perspective, injuries are thought to arise because our bodies evolved under very different environmental conditions to the ones we now live in. The argument goes that running injuries would be less common if we ran the way we evolved to run, more consistently, without excess body fat and barefoot. The problem with this way of thinking is that it's overly idealistic. Almost everything we've evolved to do involves some degree of risk, even in Paleolithic environments. We've evolved to get pregnant, yet many pregnant people experience back pain. We've evolved to eat, yet people still choke on food. We've evolved to walk, but people sprain their ankles simply strolling down the street. So why would running be any different? In reality, running injuries, like most injuries, arise from the interaction of multiple variables, which together create risk factors for injury. In injury epidemiology research, these risk factors are typically classified as either intrinsic or extrinsic. Intrinsic risk factors are things that are internal to the individual, for example, age, sex, body composition, previous injury history, or certain anatomical characteristics. Extrinsic risk factors are external, things like training behaviors, footwear, running surfaces, or environmental conditions. Intrinsic risk factors can also be divided into non-modifiable factors like age or biological sex, and modifiable factors like body mass, strength, or aspects of training. Hundreds of studies have attempted to identify the risk factors associated with running-related injuries across different populations. The problem is that this kind of research is incredibly difficult to do well. Typically, research starts with a hypothesis, and that hypothesis needs a clear empirical rationale. It has to be grounded in existing research or theory. So for example, biomechanics studies show that runners with a higher body mass tend to experience higher joint loading at the knee and hip. So a reasonable hypothesis might be that runners with a higher body mass index are at a greater risk of injury. To test this, researchers would recruit a cohort of runners, measure their BMI, and follow them over time to see who becomes injured. But because only a proportion of runners will sustain an injury during the study period, you usually need a large number of participants to ensure the study is adequately powered. You also need qualified healthcare professionals to accurately define and diagnose injuries, and reliable ways to measure variables like BMI, which may change during the study. All of this requires time, money, and personnel. On top of that, people drop out of studies, so researchers need to recruit even more participants to account for attrition. So let's say that over a 1-year period, 10% of a cohort of 1,000 runners sustain an injury. How do we know that BMI, let's say, was actually responsible? What if the injured runners also trained differently, slept less, recovered poorly, or followed different nutritional habits? Unless those variables were measured, we simply won't know. But as you measure more variables, you need even more participants to maintain statistical power. And as data sets grow, you start to see how tightly interconnected many of these variables are. It becomes increasingly difficult to isolate the effect of any single factor. So for example, you might find no association between BMI and injury risk. That seems surprising, so you dig deeper. You examine body fat percentage instead and discover that runners with a higher BMI but a lower body fat are not at an increased risk. Then you realize that males and females tend to differ in body fat percentage, so you perform a subgroup analysis. Now you find that injury risk appears highest in males with both higher BMI and higher body fat. But then you notice that this same group tends to run fewer kilometers per week. So, is body composition really the risk factor, or is it training behavior? This kind of exploratory analysis can quickly spiral, and it's important to note that this kind of fishing for associations after the fact is actually poor research practice. The best studies predefine exactly what they intend to measure and analyze and publish their protocols in advance. This reduces the risk of finding spurious associations by chance. And even then, after a study is published, other researchers may attempt to replicate it in a different population and find very different results. Risk factors identified in recreational runners in Dublin may not apply to runners training at altitude in the Rift Valley in Kenya, for example. Despite all of these challenges though, a large body of epidemiological research does exist for runners, and when these studies are synthesized in systematic reviews and meta-analyses, 2 risk factors emerge more consistently than any other. The first is an intrinsic risk factor, a previous history of injury. The second is an extrinsic risk factor, training load. A previous history of injury is one of the strongest predictors of future injury across almost all sports, including running. 2 main theories have been proposed to explain this. The first is the causality theory. This theory suggests that inadequate rehabilitation following an initial injury leads to persistent deficits, like an incomplete level of tissue healing, residual weakness, altered movement patterns, reduced balance, or psychological factors like fear of movement, all of which increase the risk of re-injury. The limitation of this theory is that injury risk often remains elevated even after what appears to be full rehabilitation. This leads to the second theory, the non-causal marker theory. According to this view, a previous injury doesn't cause future injury. Instead, it simply marks individuals who are inherently more injury prone. This might be due to genetic factors, risk-taking behaviors, training habits, psychological traits, or other underlying characteristics. Now, at present, we don't know which of these explanations is correct, and it's quite possible that both play a role. The second major risk factor is training load, but importantly, the relationship is not linear. When evidence from multiple studies is combined, injury risk appears to follow a U-shaped curve. Injury risk tends to be highest among novice runners who start from a low baseline and rapidly increase their training, and among runners training at very high volumes, particularly when recovery is inadequate. Runners training at moderate volumes with more gradual progression tend to experience lower injury rates. So for example, some studies have shown increased injury risk in runners averaging less than 30 kilometers per week, while others have found increased risk above 65 kilometers per week. This suggests that gradual increases in training load are not only safe, but necessary to allow tissues to adapt. But volume alone doesn't tell the whole story. Injury risk appears to be particularly sensitive to sudden changes in training load, including abrupt increases in mileage, intensity, frequency, or terrain. Tissues like bone and tendon adapt much more slowly than cardiovascular fitness. This means runners can feel aerobically capable of doing more long before their tissues are ready. This mismatch is especially relevant for novice runners, but training load doesn't operate in isolation. Sleep, stress, nutrition, and recovery all influence how well tissues adapt to training. So while volume matters, how load is applied over time matters even more. Beyond previous injury and training load, many other factors have been proposed as contributors to running injury, including strength, biomechanics, running technique, and footwear. Some studies show associations, others do not. Results are difficult to generalize across runners with different body shapes and sizes and experience levels and training goals. It's also likely that these factors interact with one another, making it almost impossible to isolate their individual effects. Starting with muscle strength, there is a logical reason why weakness might increase injury risk. Muscles don't just generate propulsion, they also help control movement and attenuate forces applied to bones, joints, and connective tissue. Some studies have found that runners with reduced strength in certain muscle groups, including the hip abductors and intrinsic foot muscles, are more likely to develop injuries, particularly at the knee. That said, it's important to recognize that weakness may be both a cause and a consequence of injury. When it comes to running form, the idea is that if repetitive stress injuries arise from repeated loading, then some movement patterns might distribute those loads more favorably than others. In that sense, running is a skill. This remains controversial. One perspective, often referred to as the preferred movement path paradigm, suggests that with appropriate training and exposure, each runner naturally adopts a movement pattern that best suits their own anatomy and neuromuscular system. From this view, forcing technique changes may actually increase injury risk. Another perspective, informed by biomechanics and anthropology, suggests that there may be more and less efficient ways to run, just as there are better ways to swim or swing a golf club. Advocates of this view often highlight 4 features of good running form, though it's important to emphasize that none of these features have been consistently shown to reduce injury risk across all runners. These include avoiding excessive overstriding, maintaining a relatively higher cadence, avoiding excessive forward flexion at the waist, and avoiding very rigid heel-first landing. Many of these cues may influence loading patterns, but their effects vary widely between individuals. Footstrike pattern is a good example. Biomechanical studies show that forefoot and midfoot striking typically reduce impact peaks at the knee, but increase loads at the ankle and Achilles tendon. Heel striking is not inherently harmful, and many injury-free runners land on their heels. Transitioning to a forefoot strike can increase the risk of calf strains, Achilles tendinopathy, and metatarsal stress injuries, if not managed carefully. Studies comparing barefoot and shod running show that barefoot runners often adopt a forefoot or midfoot strike because landing heavily on the heel is uncomfortable without cushioning. But there is no clear evidence that barefoot or forefoot running reduces overall injury risk. Which brings us to the final and maybe most controversial factor, what we run in and what we run on. That's what we'll explore in the next lecture.